Today's story is so intense it left a town speechless, unfolding beneath wide skies and cold mountain winds of the Old West. In a land where women were expected to bow and men ruled with fear, destiny crossed paths with courage. It all started with one moment of resistance, quiet, personal, and underestimated, yet strong enough to ignite a war of pride and survival. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The town lay pressed between two low Montana ridges, a forgotten pocket of land most travelers rode past without a glance. Folks called it O'Coven. It had been born from gold dust, cheap whiskey, and hard sweat. But by the time this story begins, its better days were long gone. A handful of crooked buildings leaned against the wind. A church bell hung silent and rusted, and a wide dirt street baked under the sun, carrying rumors faster than any stagecoach ever could. In that town lived May Crowley. People in O'Coven liked to whisper that May carried something dark in her blood. They said it the way fearful people always do, softly, behind hands, with the certainty that comes from not knowing a person at all. The truth was simpler. May wasn't wicked. She was proud, untamed, and maybe a little too striking for a place that preferred its women quiet and small. Her hair caught the sunlight like flame, copper and gold tangled together, and her eyes held a sharpness that made men uneasy. Folks swore her stare could pin a man harder than a rifle sight. She didn't curtsy when spoken to. She didn't sweeten her voice for shopkeepers. And she never begged forgiveness for saying exactly what she thought. In O'Coven, where men liked their women obedient and unseen, that alone was enough to mark her as dangerous. Her real trouble began the day her father, Jonah Crowley, died. He'd been a prospector, half drunk on hope, half buried under debt owed to nearly everyone within 50 miles. When he passed, he left May a sagging shack, a few worn mining tools, and a reputation already rotten before she had a chance to claim her own name. May did what she could to survive. She played piano in the saloon for spare coins. She stitched up drifters when they came in bleeding. Once, she even broke a stubborn horse for Tom Riker, the deputy. None of it mattered. The men watched her too closely. The women turned cold and sharp. And before long, the town decided she didn't belong there at all. The breaking point came on a July afternoon so hot the air felt thick in the lungs. May was hauling water from the well, arms burning, dust clinging to her skirts. That was when Evan Whitlock, the mayor's son, strolled up like he owned the ground beneath her feet. His hair was slick, his smile smug, the smile of a man used to taking whatever he wanted. "You'd have an easier life," he said, reaching out, fingers lifting toward her chin. Something inside May finally gave way. Years of whispers, years of judgment. All of it surged up at once. Her hand moved before she thought. The sound of the slap cracked through the heat, sharp and final. Evan's hat flew off his head and landed in the dirt. May stood there, chest heaving, dust swirling around her boots. She pointed straight at him, her hand steady despite the fire shaking her voice. "Touch me again," she said, "and I'll put you flat in this street." Her hands were shaking with fury as the words left her mouth, sharp and fearless, promising to drop him where he stood. You can guess how that landed. Evan Whitlock's pride burned hotter than the July sun. By nightfall, he was already spinning his version of the story, telling anyone who would listen that May Crowley had gone feral, that she'd cursed him, that she was nothing more than Jonah Crowley's blood come back to haunt the town. By morning, whispers had hardened into judgment. May Crowley was no longer just a nuisance. She was O'Coven's problem. That same night, the men gathered in the back room of the saloon, where lamplight turned cheap whiskey amber and shadows clung to the walls. The air was thick with stale tobacco and unease, They weren't there to debate right or wrong. They were there to decide what to do with her. Mayor Caleb Whitlock liked order. He liked things quiet and controllable. May was neither. His voice cut through the clatter of bottles. "She's trouble," he said flatly, just like her father. "We can't throw her in jail," someone muttered. "She ain't broken any law." "But we can't let her stay," Whitlock shot back. "She'll rot this town from the inside out." The room fell silent. They were cowards, every one of them. They wanted her gone, but none had the nerve to do it themselves. Then a miner with soot still clinging to his beard spat into a tin can and spoke up. "There's a way," he said. "Saw him last week near the trading post." "The Apache," another man whispered. A single name drifted through the room like cold mountain air. Koa, half legend, half ghost, an Apache scout who'd once ridden beside soldiers, then vanished into the high country when he'd had enough of white men's wars. The stories alone were enough to make a man check his holster. Folks claimed he could track a hawk through open sky, drop a deer at 100 yards without a sound, and move through timber like smoke. At the bar, Hank Dobbs shifted uneasily. "He don't come cheap," the blacksmith muttered. Caleb Whitlock slammed his palm on the table. "Whatever it takes. If he wants silver, give him silver. If he wants whiskey, give him a barrel, but he takes the girl away." The room went dead quiet. Every man there knew it was wrong. Paying someone they feared, someone they called a savage, to haul a woman off into the wilderness. It was a dark bargain, but fear and shame have a way of sealing mouths. No one objected. At first light, a rider was sent toward Devil's Ridge with the offer. He found Koa sitting by a small fire, sagewood burning low. The Apache didn't move. He sat as still as carved stone, his face unreadable, his eyes dark and steady as river rock. He didn't look like a man who had any use for money. He looked like a man who owed nothing to anyone. Koa listened in silence while the messenger spilled his words, voice tight with nerves. His eyes stayed on the horizon, where Oakhaven shimmered under a veil of heat. "They want me to take their woman," Koa said calmly. The rider corrected him at once, sweat darkening his collar in the morning sun. "Not their woman. She don't belong to anyone, but they're offering good silver to have her taken off their hands." "A problem." Koa nudged the ashes of his fire with a stick, then stopped. He weighed the word. "A problem," he repeated. "You mean she's free?" The messenger shifted in his saddle, uneasy. "Just say you'll do it." Koa lifted his gaze. If the man had been watching closely, he might have caught the brief flicker in those dark eyes, something close to a smile. Not cruel. Knowing. "Tell them I'll come tonight," Koa said. By evening, the light broke red and heavy over Oakhaven. Sunset bled across the sky, washing the dusty street in colors of rust and old wine. May Crowley stood outside the general store, spine straight, chin raised, locked in yet another argument. "I told you I don't owe you a damn thing," she snapped at Edgar Mills. "You owe this town for your father's debts," the shopkeeper barked back. "Pay up or get out." "Then I'll get out," May hissed. She slammed her last few coins onto the barrel and stepped into the street, boots kicking up dust as she turned away. Her hands were shaking, but she refused to let it show. Pride held her upright when fear tried to bend her. That was when she saw him. The town went silent. The air thickened as a rider came in from the far end of the street, mounted on a horse black as night. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, dark hair tied back with a strip of leather. The setting sun cast his face in shadow. It was Koa. May had heard the whispers. She knew the stories, how he lived beyond the ridges, untouched by law or mercy. Any other woman might have frozen or fled, but May Crowley wasn't like other women. As he drew closer, the silence stretched tight as a drawn bow. His eyes found hers, and something stirred in her chest. Fear, maybe, but not the kind that sent you running. It was the fear that comes just before you leap into open air. Fear of what you don't yet understand. He reined in a few feet from her. The horse snorted, tossing its head, while the town held its breath. "You're the one they call May Crowley," he said. His voice came out rough, like stone dragged across earth, but there was steadiness beneath it. May lifted her chin and met his gaze without blinking. "And you're the man they paid to take me." He gave a single nod. "They want you gone." "I don't take orders from cowards," she shot back, flicking her eyes toward the saloon where she knew Caleb Whitlock watched from behind closed shutters. "And neither should you." Koa studied her then. Truly studied her. He saw the fire threaded through her hair, the defiance set in her stance, and the deep weariness she tried so hard to hide behind sharp words and pride. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice dropping low. He swung down from the saddle in one slow, controlled motion. When he stood in front of her, he seemed to block out the street itself, tall and solid, carrying the scent of pine smoke and worn leather. "Because I heard you were alone," he said, "and I don't leave people alone in places that hate them." The silence between them grew heavy, thick as a storm waiting to break. May searched his face, expecting mockery, cruelty, maybe even pity. She found none of it. Only calm, and something untamed she couldn't put a name to. "So, what happens now?" she asked at last. Koa looked past her, toward the far end of the street, where the old church leaned crooked against the sky. Its bell hung rusted and silent in the fading light. "We go there," he said. May blinked. "The church?" "We said it right," he answered. Her breath caught. Her heart slammed hard against her ribs as she stared at him, trying to make sense of what she'd heard. "You mean—" "Yes," he said simply. "Tonight." And just like that, the bargain was made. Not the one the town had paid for. Not the scheme Caleb Whitlock had whispered into being over whiskey and shadows. This was something else entirely. Something forged from desperation and dignity. The outcast woman and the Apache legend turned together and started toward the church. From behind windows and doorways, the people of Oak Haven watched, believing they had won, believing they were finally shedding a curse. They had no idea at all that they had just set a story in motion that would outlive every one of them. The sun bled low over the western ridge, throwing long, bruised shadows across Oak Haven's main street. The heat still clung to the air, heavy and suffocating, and beneath it lay a tension sharp as copper on the tongue. The town held its breath in a thick, watchful silence, the kind that comes just before everything changes. The silence pressed down on the street, the kind that comes just before a storm finally tears the sky apart. May Crowley walked beside the horse, her boots stirring small clouds of dust with every step. She didn't look back at the general store. She didn't glance toward the saloon, where Caleb Whitlock and his men were surely hidden behind shutters, glasses clinking in celebration of a problem they believed solved. May kept her eyes forward, fixed on the man leading the horse at her side. Koa moved with a smooth, unsettling grace. Despite the thick stillness of the evening, he made no sound at all. To the townsfolk peering out from behind curtains and cracked doors, he was a ghost, a paid savage come to haul the town witch away. But to May, walking in the edge of his shadow, he felt like the only solid ground left in a world that had turned to sinking sand. They reached the church at the far end of the street. It leaned tiredly, its white paint peeling like old skin, its bell tower crooked and silent against the darkening sky. The heavy doors were shut tight, as if trying to keep the town's sins locked outside. Koa didn't knock. He pushed the oak doors open with one firm motion. The hinges groaned, the sound echoing down the empty street like a wounded breath. He gestured for May to go first. She stopped at the threshold, hesitating. The church smelled of stale wax and ancient wood, a scent May had always tied to judgment, never mercy. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely there. Koa didn't answer. He simply looked at her. His face gave nothing away, but there was no cruelty in it, none of the hunger or spite she had learned to expect from men. He waited, and for the first time in years, May trusted the instinct that told her to step forward instead of run. Inside, Reverend Holt was polishing a brass candlestick, his back turned. When he saw them, the outcast woman with flame-bright hair and the Apache scout filling the doorway, his hands faltered. The candlestick nearly slipped from his grip as he began to tremble. His eyes darted toward the window, as if hoping the sheriff might appear. "You," he stammered. "You can't be here," the mayor said. "The mayor paid for a task." "He did," Koa replied. His voice was low, steady, carrying through the timbered walls. It wasn't loud, but it held more weight than any sermon ever spoken from that pulpit. "And I am here to finish it." Koa walked down the center aisle, his boots striking the floorboards with slow, deliberate purpose. May followed, feeling as though she were moving through a dream, or a fever she couldn't wake from. "Holt," Koa said. The preacher blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a man pulled from deep water. I beg your pardon?" "Holt," Koa repeated. "Now." The preacher let out a thin, panicked sound, wiping his slick palms against his frock coat. It isn't proper. And she's—" His words fell apart as his eyes flicked toward the doors, where a small knot of men had gathered outside. At their front stood Caleb Whitlock, staring in open disbelief at what was unfolding. Koa didn't spare the crowd a glance. He reached into his belt, drew out a worn leather pouch, and tipped it over the communion table. Silver coins spilled across the wood, flashing dully in the lamplight. The same silver the town had scraped together to pay for May Crowley's removal. The clatter of metal against wood cut through the church like a knife. "Do it," Koa said. The preacher stared at the coins, then at the Apache's eyes. Dark, steady, unyielding. At last, he looked toward the mayor outside, frozen in place, torn between stepping in and letting the moment pass. Fear decided for him. With trembling hands, the preacher opened his book. The pages shook so hard they whispered like dry leaves in autumn. May stood beside Koa, suddenly aware of how small she was next to him. Yet she felt anchored there, rooted. She lifted her gaze to his profile, hard and unmoving, as if carved from stone. He wasn't doing this for love. He couldn't be. He barely knew her. And still he was binding himself to her, her debts, her disgrace, in the eyes of God and the men who despised her. The ceremony blurred together. Words drifted past her ears, to have and to hold, for richer, for poorer, and the bitter irony wasn't lost on her. She had nothing. He had the open wilderness. And yet when Koa said "I do," his voice rang clear and unwavering, a vow spoken not to the church, but to something far larger. When it was over, the silence inside the church was crushing. The preacher snapped his book shut, looking close to collapse. Koa turned to May then. For the first time, his expression softened. He ignored the preacher, ignored the men crowding the doorway. He looked only at her. "They paid me to take you away," he said, his voice rough but steady. May searched his eyes, waiting for the trick. "I know," she whispered. "But I don't take a woman I don't honor," he said. "You are my wife now, and the mountains will know your name." The word honor knocked the breath from her chest. It had been years since anyone had spoken it alongside her name, since Jonah Crowley was still alive. Koa didn't wait for her reply. He turned and began walking back down the aisle, his steps firm and final, leaving the church and the town, reeling behind them. The sound of Koa's boots struck the floorboards with final authority as he moved down the aisle. May Crowley followed him, her heart hammering a wild, unsteady rhythm against her ribs. They stepped out into the dying light. The crowd split without a word. At the front stood Caleb Whitlock, his face locked between disbelief and simmering fury. He had wanted her gone, cast out, broken, dragged away by a man he could call a savage and forget about. This was not what he'd planned. This was not how it was supposed to end. Koa stopped directly in front of him. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His stare alone peeled the mayor down to what he truly was, stripping away title, fine clothes, and false authority, leaving a small, exposed man standing in the dust. Then Koa turned away. He swung up onto his horse in one smooth motion and reached down. His hand was broad, calloused, and warm. May took it, and he lifted her behind him as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. She wrapped her arms around his waist, the rough leather of his vest pressed against her cheek. Beneath it, she felt the steady beat of his heart. Slow, unshaken. "Let's go," she whispered. Koa nudged the horse forward, and they rode down the main street of Oakhaven. Past the saloon. Past the well where she'd been shamed. Past the houses of women who'd whispered that she was cursed. May held her head high as her hair streamed behind her like fire caught in the wind, refusing to bow, refusing to show the fear still trembling in her hands. The town watched in stunned silence. Some crossed themselves, some spat in the dirt, and some, though they'd never admit it, felt the sting of shame. For once, Oakhaven was quiet. Gossip died in dry throats as horse and riders slipped into the deepening shadows of the ridges. The town believed the matter settled. They believed they had cleansed themselves of May Crowley. They had no idea. The sun sank behind the mountains, drowning the world in blue-gray dusk. Oakhaven shrank into a scatter of lights behind them. Ahead lay only rolling hills, open dark, and a sky wide enough to swallow the past. The horse moved with an even, unhurried rhythm, hooves thudding against hard-packed earth. Neither of them spoke for a long while. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy. Crowded with questions May wasn't ready to ask, and answers Koa wasn't yet willing to give. May finally turned her head, looking back once more toward the place she was leaving behind. She looked back one last time. Oakhaven was nothing more than a speck now, a dark mark on the land, like a scar that never quite fades. At last she let out a breath, the wind tearing it from her lips as quickly as it came. She tightened her hold around Koa's waist. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice small against the rush of air. "I know," Koa answered. His eyes stayed on the trail ahead. He didn't turn. "Then why?" May Crowley asked. "Why marry me? You could have taken the silver and left me at the nearest outpost." Koa slowed the horse as they started up a rocky rise. He lifted his gaze to the horizon, where the first stars were beginning to pierce the falling night. "They paid me to take you away," he said, "and I wanted them to see that I don't take what isn't given." May frowned, pressing her face into his back to shield it from the cold. "Marriage makes it right?" she asked, doubt sharpening her tone. "You think a few words in a church make any of this right?" You don't even know me." Koa shifted slightly in the saddle. "I know what I see." "And what's that?" "A woman who doesn't bow to men who haven't earned it." May went quiet. The words settled deep in her chest, warm and unfamiliar. It was more kindness than she'd heard spoken to her in months, maybe years. They rode on until the moon climbed high, full and silver, lighting the rough path ahead. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of pine resin and damp earth. They were gaining elevation, leaving the suffocating valley of Oakhaven far below. When the last trace of daylight finally vanished, Koa guided the horse toward a stand of cottonwoods beside a narrow creek. Water sang softly over stone, lonely and beautiful. "We stop here," he said. He swung down and helped her dismount, his hands steady and gentle, lingering just long enough to be sure she was balanced before letting go. May stood by the stream, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, watching him move. Koa worked with quiet efficiency, gathering wood and coaxing a fire to life with practiced ease. There was no wasted motion in him. He was still a stranger. Still her husband. A man the town had called a savage. Yet as the flames caught and began to crackle, throwing restless shadows across his calm, unreadable face, May felt a sudden jolt of clarity. She felt safer here, alone in the wilderness with this dangerous man, than she ever had in the town that was supposed to be her home. She sat across from him, firelight flickering in her eyes, caught somewhere between disbelief and defiance. Koa reached into his saddlebag and handed her a strip of jerky. "You should rest," he said. "I'm not tired," May lied. Her body ached for sleep, every muscle begging for rest, but her thoughts ran too fast to slow down. Koa nodded as if he understood, without needing it explained. He leaned back against a fallen log, eyes lifted to the stars burning sharp and bright above the pines. "You're afraid," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I'm not," May Crowley snapped, the denial spilling out too fast to be convincing. "Yes, you are," he replied. His voice stayed calm, steady, like a deep river that didn't rush no matter the storm. "You think I'll treat you the way they did, like you're a debt to be claimed." He looked at her then, firelight cutting across the hard angles of his face. "But I'm not from your town." May froze, the strip of jerky halfway to her mouth. She lowered it slowly. "You talk like you know me," she muttered, old defenses trying to climb back into place. Koa stirred the fire with a stick, sparks lifting into the night like scattered stars. "I know loneliness," he said, "and I know pride. They walk the same road." May studied him. Truly studied him. For the first time, she saw past the stories Oakhaven had wrapped around his name. She didn't see a ghost or a monster. She saw a man who sat like someone who had known exile just as she had. Someone pushed aside for being different, for refusing to bend. He wasn't her captor. In a strange, unsettling way, he was her reflection. Koa reached into his pocket. May flinched without thinking, but he only drew out a thin leather cord. A piece of turquoise hung from it, rough cut and blue as a summer sky. He held it out to her. "What's this?" she asked, hesitating. "Protection," he said. "My mother made it. She said no evil follows the color of the sky." May looked at the stone, then at his open hand. It wasn't payment. It wasn't a bargain. It was a gift. She reached for it, her fingers brushing his palm as she took the cord. The contact sent a sharp tingle up her arm. "You shouldn't give me this," she said, her voice unsteady. "You don't even know if I believe in things like that." Koa watched her fingers curl around the turquoise. "I don't need you to believe," he said. "It's enough that I do." May lowered her gaze, gripping the stone like it might anchor her. "They said you were dangerous," she murmured. Koa's mouth curved into the faintest smile, softening the hard lines of his face. "They were right," he said. "Just not to you." The fire cracked between them, sparks rising and falling, a line drawn and a bridge built all at once. The night air sharpened, the cold settling in around them. Yet for the first time in longer than she could remember, it didn't sink into May Crowley's bones. "You sleep," Koa said. He rose and spread his blanket near the fire, laying it out for her. "I'll keep watch." "Watch for what?" May asked. "Wolves," he replied. "Men. Dreams." May gave a short, bitter laugh. "I don't know which one scares me more." "Dreams," Koa said quietly, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. "They come when you can't run." May lay down on the blanket. It smelled of smoke, horse, and sage. She curled onto her side, fingers closing tight around the turquoise stone. Through half-lowered lashes, she watched him stand guard, his silhouette etched against the stars. He looked like something shaped from the land itself, solid, silent, unyielding. Her thoughts drifted to O'Cavan, to Caleb Whitlock's sneer, to the life she was leaving behind. It already felt far away, like a bad dream loosening its grip. As sleep finally took her, the steady murmur of the creek blended with the soft crackle of the fire, and May understood something at last. The town had paid Koa to carry her off into the middle of nowhere. But as her eyes closed beneath the open sky, she didn't feel lost. Not for the first time in her life. She felt found. Dawn came before May stirred. She woke to the bite of cool air and the scent of wood smoke and strong coffee, sharp and clean. For a single heartbeat, she forgot where she was. She half expected the peeling walls of her father's shack, the dust of O'Cavan settling in her throat. Instead, she saw cottonwood leaves overhead, pale light filtering through them like stained glass. May pushed herself upright, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. Koa was already awake, kneeling by the fire, boiling water in a battered tin pot. His movements were precise and quiet. He didn't look like a man who'd spent the night watching for danger. He looked like he belonged to the morning itself. Calm, inevitable, steady. "Do you always wake this early?" May asked, her voice rough with sleep. He didn't turn, but she caught the slight tilt of his head. "Before the sun," he said. "The world speaks loudest when men are still asleep." May watched him, studying the wide set of his shoulders. Back in town, men filled silence with noise, boasting, complaining, bargaining, afraid of what quiet might make them face. But Koa let the quiet stand on its own. He didn't look at May Crowley like she was fragile, something to be pitied, or like a stain that needed hiding. He simply allowed her to exist as she was. They broke camp not long after, leaving the cottonwoods and the murmuring creek behind. As they rode farther into the high country, the world slowly reshaped itself. With every mile, it looked less like anything May had ever known. The fences were gone, the lines that carved land into ownership and obligation. The rutted streets of O'Cavan faded into memory. The earth rolled and dipped around them, wide and unclaimed, stitched together with rock, sage, and endless sky. Ahead, the mountains rose sharp and unforgiving, like the exposed bones of the land itself, ancient, relentless, alive. To May, they had always been a distant wall on the horizon, a boundary she was never meant to cross. Now she was riding straight into their heart. Days slipped past in a wash of gold and green. They moved through pine forests where sunlight scattered across the ground like spilled coins. They followed streams fed by melting snow, water so clear it looked like poured glass. Koa spoke little, but when he did, his words mattered. May came to understand that he was teaching her, not with instruction, not with commands, but through example. He showed her which berries would sweeten a pot and which would still a heartbeat. He taught her how to feel the wind on her skin, how to listen when the jay cried warning and when the squirrel went suddenly silent. One afternoon, as they edged along a narrow ridge, the trail turned steep and cruel. Loose shale slid beneath the horses' hooves, rattling down into the canyon below. May's horse skittered, ears pinned flat. Once, panic would have taken her whole. Instead, May drew a slow breath of thin mountain air, steadied her hands, and spoke softly to the animal. She didn't fight it. She moved with it, guiding with calm pressure until they reached solid ground on the plateau above. When she glanced back, she caught Koa watching her. There was something faint at the corner of his mouth, a shadow of a smile. "What?" she asked, brushing loose hair from her face. "You ride like a man," he said. May smirked, the old spark flashing in her eyes. "Is that supposed to offend me?" "It's a compliment," Koa replied evenly. "You don't carry fear in your hands." She stared at him, caught off guard. Then a laugh rose up from her chest. It wasn't the brittle, polite sound she used in the saloon. It was raw and bright and unshaped, loud enough to startle a burst of birds from the brush. The sound surprised her as much as it did the forest. Koa's eyes creased slightly at the corners as he watched her, and for a moment the mountain seemed to listen. It was the first time she had felt truly light in years. By midday, they reached a broad, high meadow where wildflowers spread thick across the ground, violet, yellow, and red, while the air carried the sweet bite of pine resin. Koa dismounted and let the horses drink from a clear stream. May Crowley slid down from the saddle, her boots sinking into the soft grass. She walked to the water's edge and studied her reflection. She looked changed, skin darkened by sun, hair tousled by wind, the kind of woman the town had tried to scrub away. Her fingers drifted to her neck, finding the turquoise stone he had given her. She rubbed its smooth surface with her thumb. "Protection," he'd said. "No evil follows the color of the sky." She turned and watched him. He was checking the horse's hooves, hands steady and careful, gentle, yet undeniably strong. "You said you'd take me away," May said, breaking the quiet. "But where are we going?" Koa paused, lowering the horse's leg. He looked towards the far horizon where snow-capped peaks cut clean against the sky. "Home?" she asked. "You mean, to your people?" A shadow crossed his face, quick and dark as a cloud passing the sun. "They're gone," he said simply. "Soldiers took them south years ago. The land is what's left." There was no anger in his voice, only a calm resignation that tightened May's chest. She stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. "Then why stay?" she asked softly. "Why live out here alone?" Koa met her gaze, his eyes reflecting the endless blue overhead. He knelt by the stream and filled their canteens, water rushing over his fingers. "Because the land doesn't lie." May watched the current swirl. She thought of Caleb Whitlock's practiced smiles, of Edgar Mills calling her family, then turning her out when the money dried up. She thought of the lies that held O'Coven together. "Men do," she finished quietly. "That's true enough," Koa said, capping the canteen. He studied her with that intense, unreadable look. You learn fast. Had to, May replied, her mouth twisting into a thin smile. The world doesn't give women much choice. Koa held her gaze for a long moment. The wind tugged at his dark hair, and the silence around them grew heavy, charged with things unsaid. Then he spoke, low and rough. Then maybe it's time it gave you peace. The words lingered between them, a promise she was afraid to believe. As days turned into weeks, a rhythm took shape. A life began to assemble itself out of the wild. They found a place near a ridge overlooking a valley thick with green, where the land opened wide and the future felt, for the first time, possible. A place where the water ran deep and the game was easy to find. It wasn't a house. Not yet. It was a shelter. A camp. But to May Crowley, it felt more permanent than anywhere she had ever known. The change didn't come gently. The wilderness had no use for her pride. May stumbled through the learning, burned rabbit stew until it was bitter, tore her skirts on thorns, cursed the rocky trails that left her feet bruised and aching. Back in town, mistakes had always drawn laughter and scorn. She braced herself for the same here. For Koa to lose patience, to call her useless, to regret the choice he'd made. He never did. He watched her quietly, as always, and when she failed, he stepped in, not to take over, not to shame her, but to show her how. Slowly, without words, as if time itself bent around his calm. You learn fast, he said one morning, after she finally coaxed a fire to life using flint and steel on her own. May smiled faintly, blowing on the fragile flame until it caught. Guess I had a good teacher. Koa shook his head. No, he said. You had the will to live that night. The stars burned sharp and close overhead, bright enough to cut the sky. The air carried the bite of a season turning. They sat by the fire, its glow warm and restless against the dark. May drew her knees up beneath her skirt, watching Koa carve a piece of wood. His hands moved with a steady precision that held her attention. They'll be talking about us, she said suddenly, the thought breaking the quiet. Let them, Koa replied, without looking up. You don't understand, May said, frustration tightening her voice. Those people, they'll twist it. They'll say I ran off with you, that I wanted it. Koa stopped carving. He lifted his gaze and met hers across the fire, his look steady and unflinching. Didn't you? He asked. May blinked, caught off guard. What? Freedom, he said. A life that isn't theirs. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words never came. Instead, she stared into the fire, then out into the vast dark pressing in around them. She remembered the fear she once carried like a stone in her chest. It was gone. She had fought so long just to be left alone that she hadn't understood what she truly wanted wasn't solitude at all. It was peace. And somehow, sitting here beside this man, wrapped in firelight and silence, she was closer to it than she had ever been, someone who had no reason at all to help her. And yet, she felt closer to peace than she ever had. May turned her attention fully to Koa. She really looked at him this time. Firelight moved across his face, catching the hard line of his jaw, the depth in his eyes. He looked like the land itself, rough, dangerous, shaped by storms, and still, undeniably beautiful. You talk strange, she whispered, a smile pulling at her mouth. You listen strange, he replied. A faint smile answered her own. May let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. You're not like any man I've ever known. Koa held her gaze as the fire crackled between them. Good, he said. Later, when the flames sank to glowing embers, May found herself watching him again. The way he sat, alert but at ease, as if the earth itself moved through his lungs. When he noticed her staring, he tilted his head. "What?" "Nothing," she said too quickly. Then, after a pause, "Just trying to figure you out." He nodded once. "And what do you see?" She hesitated. "A man who isn't afraid of anything." Koa let out a quiet breath of a laugh that never reached his eyes. "Everyone fears something, May Crowley." "And what do you fear?" she asked, her voice steady in the dark. He looked up at the stars, his expression turning grave. "Losing something," he said softly. "Before I know I have it." May couldn't answer. Her heart began to race, uneven and sharp against her ribs. Her fingers drifted to the turquoise charm at her throat. Far behind them, Okaivan slept, convinced the problem had been erased. But out here, beneath the wide sky and whispering pines, something was taking shape. Something raw and fragile that neither of them yet dared to name. The wall between them was lowering, stone by stone. And in the deep quiet of the wilderness, May was finally learning what freedom truly felt like. Love born of the wild is never gentle. It isn't easy, either. It's earned, struck like fire from flint, sparked by friction, endurance, and survival. And sometimes, that spark needs danger to breathe. It came on an afternoon that seemed harmless enough. The sun rode high, spilling through the pines in dusty gold beams. May was gathering wood for the evening fire, arms full of dry cedar, her thoughts drifting as she hummed softly to herself. It was something she hadn't done since she was a girl, letting the warmth of the day rest on her neck, letting her guard slip. And in the high country, the moment you stop listening is the moment the mountains remind you who holds the power. It began with a sound. Sharp. Heavy. The crack of a branch snapping behind her. It wasn't the quick scatter of a squirrel or the soft step of a deer. This was slow. Intentional. May Crowley turned, the bundle of wood slipping from her arms and forgotten. Out of the deep shade at the edge of the trees, a bear emerged. It was enormous. Dark, matted fur hung from its frame as it lumbered into the clearing, each step carrying a terrible, deliberate weight. It stopped when it saw her. Its head dipped, swaying slightly, small black eyes locking onto her as a low, rumbling growl rolled from its chest and vibrated through her bones. May froze. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to obey. Her heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was alone, unarmed, and death stood a few yards away, breathing musk and rot into the air. The bear rose up, a wall of muscle and claw, and then a single, thunderous crack split the clearing. The sound tore through the silence. The bear lurched, a roar of pain ripped short as its body collapsed, hitting the ground with a force that shook the earth beneath May's feet. Smoke still hung in the air when the forest fell quiet again. Koa was there. He didn't rush. He moved like a storm, swift, unstoppable, terrifyingly controlled. He stepped between May and the fallen beast, rifle raised, his eyes lit with something she had never seen before. Not rage, not fear, something fierce and focused, like lightning trapped in stone. He didn't lower the weapon. He waited, watching for movement that never came. The woods held their breath. May stood shaking, breath breaking into short, sharp pulls. She couldn't look away from his back. He was a wall, a shield planted between her and the raw violence of the world. At last, Koa lowered the rifle. He turned toward her, his face tight with adrenaline, eyes scanning her with urgent precision. "You're hurt," he said, voice low but edged with command. May shook her head, words caught somewhere deep in her chest. She looked down at her hands. They trembled so badly she couldn't make them still. "No," she whispered at last. I didn't even see it until it was right there. Koa didn't reach for her. He wasn't a man for open displays beneath the sun. But he stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the steady strength of him, close enough that the shaking in her body finally began to ease. Instead, he reached out and set a hand on her shoulder. His grip was solid, steady, anchoring her, pulling her back from the edge of panic. "You're safe," he said. Those 2 words carried more weight than 100 sermons ever could. "You're safe." That night, the camp felt different, quieter. The rush of fear had burned itself out, leaving behind a deep, unfamiliar exhaustion. May Crowley found herself unable to settle. Koa sat by the fire, carefully cleaning his rifle, the metal catching the orange glow. He looked composed, almost untouched, as if he hadn't just faced death head-on. But May noticed the tension still locked in his jaw. She sat down beside him. The space between them felt charged now, alive with things neither of them had said. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered, eyes fixed on the flames. Koa paused, the cloth in his hand still against the barrel. He lifted his gaze to her, dark eyes reflecting firelight. "Yes," he said. "I did." May hesitated. She wanted to press him, to understand this man who gave without asking. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why risk yourself for me?" He set the rifle aside and turned fully toward her. The intensity in his gaze stole the breath from her lungs. "Because you're mine to protect." The words hung between them. Mine. Back in Oakhaven, that word had meant ownership, debt, a woman reduced to something counted and claimed. May stiffened, old defenses snapping back into place. Koa caught the change immediately. He leaned closer, his voice dropping low, quiet, fierce, intimate. "That's not what I mean," he said. "Not property, not debt." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers, not touching, waiting. "You're mine because I chose you," he went on, "because you walked beside me when you could have turned away." Something tight broke loose in her chest. Heat burned behind her eyes. May had spent her life being discarded, tolerated, bought and sold in quieter ways. But never, not once, had she been chosen. He wasn't claiming her. He was recognizing her. Standing beside him in this harsh, untamed world, she understood that he saw her as a partner, as an equal. She wanted to speak, to tell him that for the first time she didn't feel wanted for her beauty or her usefulness, but for who she was. And the realization shook her to the core. The woman with soot on her hands and fire in her spirit. The words rose in May Crowley's chest, then tangled and fell apart. They felt too small for what pressed between them. So she stayed silent. Instead, she reached out. Her hand, small, pale, still trembling, crossed the space between them. She found his hand rough and scarred, shaped by a lifetime of survival, and she closed her fingers around it. It was a simple act, just skin meeting skin. But in the stillness of the mountain valley, beneath a sky scattered with indifferent stars, it carried more meaning than any promise ever spoken inside a church. Koa didn't pull away. He threaded his fingers through hers, his grip warm and steady. As the fire snapped and settled into embers, May understood that the bear wasn't the only thing that had fallen that day. The last wall around her heart had finally given way. She wasn't only safe, she was home. Peace on the frontier is a fragile thing. Thin ice stretched over a rushing river. Beautiful and easily broken. For May and Koa, the fracture came with the sound of hooves striking stone. It was midday when they appeared. 6 riders, dust-caked and hard-eyed, their approach cutting through the quiet. At their head rode Caleb Whitlock, his tailored suit looking absurd against the wild pines. He hadn't come seeking justice. He'd come for profit. Whitlock dismounted without courtesy, his gaze sliding over May with a familiar sneer. Then he spoke the truth that had been buried with Jonah Crowley. Her father hadn't only left debt behind. He'd left land. Land Whitlock's men had discovered carried silver veins beneath its skin. "It's business," Whitlock said, holding out a paper. "Sign the deed and I'll leave you and your savage alone." May's stomach tightened. They'd driven her out, dragged her name through the dirt, and now they wanted the last scrap of what had been her father's. She drew breath to answer. But Koa stepped forward. His voice was low, steady, dangerous in its calm. "She owes you nothing." Whitlock laughed, though the sound carried an edge of nerves. He answered with threats instead, warnings that O'Caven never forgot a slight, then mounted up and rode away. But both May and Koa understood men like Whitlock didn't ask twice. The attack came 2 nights later. It began with fire. A streak of torchlight tore through the dark and struck the cabin wall. Flames climbed fast, crackling greedy and loud in the night air. Koa was moving before May was fully awake. "Out the back!" he shouted, pressing his rifle into her hands as he grabbed his knife. The night shattered into chaos. Gunfire ripped through the trees. Smoke rolled thick and choking. Koa fought like something unleashed, moving through flame and shadow, holding the line alone. May coughed hard, eyes burning, the taste of smoke filling her mouth as the world around her erupted, knowing, with terrifying clarity, that the fragile peace they'd found was now under siege. She didn't run. She wasn't the shaking girl from the town well anymore. May Crowley raised the rifle, steadying her breath, and she fired. The shot cracked through the night, driving back the men trying to circle them. They survived, but the price was steep. Their shelter burned to nothing. At dawn, only blackened timbers and drifting ash remained. Koa stood among the embers, blood darkening his skin where a bullet had torn across his shoulder. May looked at the ruins, then at him. Fear tried to climb her throat, but rage burned hotter. "They'll keep coming," she said. "They won't ever stop." Koa met her gaze, his face streaked with soot and sweat. "Then we'll give them a story worth fearing." At first light they rode back into O'Caven. The town was just waking. Doors creaked open. People stepped onto porches, rubbing sleep from their eyes, then froze. Down the main street rode 2 figures side by side, unbroken. May's dress was torn, her face marked with ash, but she sat tall. Koa rode beside her, rifle laid across his lap, his presence heavy enough to still the air itself. Caleb Whitlock staggered out of the saloon, color draining from his face. You can't be here," he stammered. "Oh, we are," May said, her voice cold. "And I'm here to end this." She drew a folded paper from her pocket, the deed Whitlock had wanted so badly. She struck a match. Flame kissed the dry parchment, curling the edges, devouring ink and promises alike until only blackened ash remained. "Now it belongs to no one," she said, letting the burning scraps fall into the dust. Whitlock lunged forward, fury twisting his features, but Koa turned his horse and blocked him. He didn't lift his weapon. He didn't need to. He looked down at the small, grasping man. "You thought you could buy her," Koa said quietly. "You thought you could pay someone to make your problems disappear." The town leaned in, every ear straining. "You paid me to take her away," Koa went on, "and I did." He bent closer, his voice carrying the weight of the mountains. "But you didn't know what that meant." He glanced at May, then back to Whitlock. "You paid me to love her." Whitlock's mouth opened. No sound came out. In stunned silence, O'Caven watched as the Apache and the woman they had cast aside turned their horses and rode away. They didn't look back. They didn't have to. They had already won. That winter, the town would remember the day it learned what it truly meant to lose. The snows came early to the high country. By the time the first frost slid down from the ridgelines, May Crowley and Koa had finished building a new home. It sat deeper in the mountains, far beyond the reach of greedy hands and small, fearful towns. The cabin was simple. Pine logs fitted tight, stone set with care, but every beam carried effort, and every rock had been placed with intention. The wilderness no longer frightened May. She had learned its language. She knew how the wind spoke through the pines, how silence could warn or comfort, how the fire in the hearth was something alive that needed tending, not taking for granted. One evening, while firelight flickered across the cabin walls, May reached for Koa's hand and placed it gently over her belly. He looked at her then, eyes widening, not with fear, but with a quiet, overwhelming wonder. Understanding passed between them without words. "Our child," he whispered. Koa glanced around the cabin, then out the small window toward the snow-covered peaks that had sheltered them. "The world tried to take everything from us," he said softly. "Now we give something back," and they did. They named him Nakai, the one who walks between worlds. Years passed the way pages turn in a well-loved book, the cabin filled with laughter and the soft rush of small feet on wooden floors. Koa taught Nakai how to read tracks, how to listen when the forest went still. May taught him letters and stories, and how to understand the hearts of people as carefully as the land beneath his feet. They grew old together. Their hair faded to the pale white of winter snow, their faces shaped by sun, wind, and time. But the love between them never thinned. It deepened, like the roots of ancient cedars gripping the earth. Travelers passing through those high ranges would sometimes see a thin ribbon of smoke rising from a distant ridge. They would lower their voices and say, "That's their place." And long after May and Koa were gone, the story remained. The mountain people swore that on quiet nights, when the stars burned low and the wind lay still, you could look toward that ridge and see two shadows by a fire. A woman and a man, sitting side by side, watching over the land that had given them everything. A love not bought, not bargained, but born wild and free. And that is the legend of May Crowley and Koa. A reminder that sometimes the things we fear losing most are the very things we must release in order to find where we truly belong. The fire burned low, its glow steady against the dark, and the horizon lay open and quiet beyond the trees. Somewhere in that stillness, the land kept breathing, holding the memory of every step taken and every choice made. The mountains watched as they always had, patient and unjudging, while the night settled gently around the camp. And with eyes lifted towards the distant ridges, the story rested, not ended, but carried forward, alive in the silence of the frontier. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. We appreciate you more than you think. If this tale stirred something deep inside, we invite you to remain part of this frontier of memories. More true stories of honor, compassion, and destiny are waiting for you here. Subscribe, share, comment, and thank you for riding with us today. Aviso legal, disclaimer. Our content is designed for artistic and entertainment purposes and may reinterpret historical themes using fictional touches. We apply AI tools thoughtfully, only to support production, while keeping human supervision over editing, emotional tone, and narrative coherence. We always comply with regulatory guidelines for AI-based media and avoid deepfake practices or identity manipulation. All supporting components remain legally sourced. Please ask for authorization before sharing or adapting any segment. Your respect makes it possible for us to continue telling meaningful stories.